coming. Thank you to Daniel, to Veronica for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here in Montevideo. I apologize for speaking in English, but there's lots of images to look at. So I'm going to be talking about the kind of a partial death of photography and a rebirth of photography tonight. Some major changes in photography, so certain things that we used to think about photography don't work anymore, and there are many, many new possibilities. If you think of the painters in the 19th century, when photography came, people said painting was dead, but painting had some of its greatest periods with expressionists, cubists, pointillists, and so on. And painting did not die, just certain parts of painting. And I think the same is true of photography. So I'm going to speak a little bit fast because I want to show many things, and we'll try to finish in the 45 minutes. In the United States last spring, we had a big moment when the Chicago Sun-Times, one of the major newspapers in the country, on one day fired their entire photography department of 28 people, including somebody who won the Pulitzer Prize. It's a 150-year-old newspaper. And they said they don't need photographers anymore. They're just going to give iPhones to the reporters. There's no need for photographers. So the question becomes, one could be very angry, but the question also becomes, what does a photographer do now that 1 billion people with cell phones, for example, cannot do? What does the photographer do differently or do better than all those people out there? It is said that right now, every 2 minutes, we take as many photographs in 2 minutes as were made in the entire 19th century. There's an enormous number of images, but one of the problems is we don't know what to do with the images. There are very, very few people who filter it, who curate it, who make sense of all those images, but we have more images than ever before, but simultaneously we're firing photographers, newspapers are going out of business, and Libération, the French daily newspaper, about 2 weeks ago published an entire edition with no photographs in protest at what's happening to photographers, war photographers, fashion photographers, portrait photographers. The entire newspaper had no photographs on the day that Paris Photo, the big photo festival, photo fair in Paris began. They published in solidarity with photographers an entire issue with no photographs in it. For me, this story begins in 1984. I wrote a piece for the New York Times Sunday magazine on the coming revolution in photography. And I wanted to show what pixels were and how easy it was to manipulate photographs. And my fear was that in a number of years, if we didn't do something about the manipulation, people would no longer believe photographs. They'd no longer be seen as a recording from the visible reality, or what you might call a quotation from appearances. They would no longer be thought of that in that way. So I had a photograph of New York City, and using a Cytex machine, which in those days cost $500,000, we changed it, so we put in the Eiffel Tower and the Transamerica Pyramid, and we changed the roof of the building on the right to turn it around. I made a traffic jam around the Eiffel Tower because I thought so many people would want to see it. The Transamerica Pyramid, you can see how we changed it, yes? So you see there's no Eiffel Tower, now there's an Eiffel Tower on the bottom left. So the idea there was to tell people 1,600,000 copies of the newspaper were published, and I wanted people to act proactively to guard the recording ability of photography. But very, very little was done. So in 1982, which was 2 years before, National Geographic's cover, they had a horizontal photograph, and they wanted to make it a vertical. So they put the pyramid on the left, more behind the one on the right. And when I asked the editor, how could you change a photograph like that on one of these Cytex machines, the $500,000 machine, they said it's really nothing. All we did was go back in time and move the photographer a couple of meters to one side to get a different point of view. So to National Geographic, they were going back in time and moving the photographer to get a different point of view, which to me was science fiction. But this is already 1982, more than 30 years ago, they were doing this. Similarly, Newsday in New York published a photograph of two ice skaters who wanted to go to the Olympics, and they showed them the next day, Tanya and Nancy, to meet at practice. This is a photograph of the next day. It's the first future news photograph that I'm aware of in 1994, showing what's going to happen the next day. And in the small type, they tell you that it's a composite. They actually put the images together. But I became very interested. Why not show what can be done in the future as opposed to just photograph the past? So for example, I'll show you later is it possible to show the future, a bad future, so it does not happen with photography? And this is when O.J. Simpson, a major football player in the U.S., a celebrity, was arrested on suspicion of double murder. Time magazine took a mugshot, a police photograph, and changed it on the right, made it darker, out of focus with a spotlight, and they were accused by almost everybody of racism. When the guy's a celebrity, he's lighter skinned, but when he's arrested on a suspicion of double murder, they make him darker. But they said that all we did was, quote, take a common mugshot and raise it to the level of art with no sacrifice to truth. So this is 1994. The picture on the right, according to Time magazine, is art, and there's no sacrifice to truth. So that's 20 years ago that this was happening. And this is the first news photograph in history that I know about which was made without a photographer and without a camera. So this was made at about the same time a Swedish airplane crash, and 8 Finnish newspapers from Finland published this news photograph as a regular news photograph, but there was no photographer and no camera present. And the way they did it was they asked 3 eyewitnesses what happened, and they composited the photograph. So this is what, so I'm saying 20 years ago we had already pictures like science fiction and invented pictures. And this one on the right says, the Lance Corporal Boudreau, the soldier, saved my dad and he rescued my sister in Iraq. And on the left it said, Lance Corporal Boudreau killed my dad and he knocked up my sister, he made her pregnant. And I asked the US Army which one was true. Did he save the dad or kill the dad? Did he save the sister or did he make her pregnant? And they said they did a 1-year study and they do not know the answer. They don't know which of the 2 photographs was actually true. Okay? I'm not sure with the translation how much ahead of you I am. Okay, so now I keep going. So then I found out, I was a psychology major in university, and I found out that this cover of Time magazine was not Sigmund Freud, but in fact was the man who changed the image of O.J. Simpson, the guy who digitally manipulated O.J. Simpson. It was him dressed up as Freud. So Time magazine was much more postmodern than we thought it was. So we tried in 1994 at the same time to come up with standards. So the idea was the image with the diagonal slash would be not a lens. So anybody who's changing a photograph just puts it under the photograph, and there's no problem. You change the photograph, but just tell everybody you did it if you're in a news magazine or a newspaper. If you're an artist, it's fine. You could do whatever you want to do, and then you could click on the symbol and find out how they changed it. But people didn't want to do that because they didn't think it was necessary. So then, similarly, what's happened is in photographs, actual photographs, many of them are manipulated as well in different ways. This won the World Press Photo, and the caption said that they're rich Lebanese visiting a neighborhood after the Israelis bombed it in Beirut, but it turned out they were not rich Lebanese. They just lived there, but they looked different than some of the other people, so the caption was completely wrong, but it was the picture of the year. The woman in the back is making cell phone images of her neighborhood, and what they said was very interesting. They said, of course, they think we don't live there because they think that war does not happen. The jury at World Press thinks that war does not happen to people who look like them. So this won the World Press Photo, and one of the things we do, and particularly in photojournalism, is repeat the same cliches, the same stereotypes, the same symbols. So this was in Yemen, a mother comforting her son during the Arab Spring. But I wondered, why does it look so much like the Pietà? why in a Muslim country do we use Christian symbols? Or it's also used in Muslim countries, but why do we keep using mother and child over and over again? And many, many photojournalists just try to make images that look like other images instead of trying to expand the vocabulary. Similarly, in the US, the Pulitzer Prize winner in 2010 looked almost the same as the Pulitzer Prize winner in 1997. And also what photographers often do, because people ask the question, what can a professional do that an amateur doesn't? And often it means they have the press pass. They're allowed to go to certain places. But often the pictures are a lie that are made with press passes. The US was not mission accomplished, which is what it says in the back about the war in Iraq. It was 1 year after it started. It went on for many more years. The picture was a fabrication. It was a lie to make the president look good. And so one idea I have, for example, is that all professional photographers should never, ever photograph a press conference again, but they should go out and do more important work and more interesting work in the street, and we should just have robots photograph press conferences and use the professionals to do more interesting work. So this was the US invading Haiti to save it for democracy in 1994, and this is what it looked like from the side. So another idea was when we publish a photograph like this, which is obviously not really the way it was, then the reader should be able to put the mouse from the computer on the image and see the second image and see what was actually happening. And the reason I thought that was there was a press conference in the desert with the Israelis, Jordanians, Palestinians, Americans, and so on, and they air-conditioned it so nobody would sweat, because if you sweat, it looks like the negotiations are going badly. And it costs $500,000 so they don't sweat in the press conference. And so the suggestion was the photographers show the air conditioners in the second image, and that way we spend the $500,000 to build a school. Something more interesting. It's okay? Okay. So what happened, remember I was worried in 1984 nobody would believe photographs if we don't do something. So when the US killed Osama bin Laden, the #1 enemy for many years, they would not publish a photograph of the dead man. One, they didn't want to make angry many Muslims, but number two, the White House, the president, the government said, nobody believes photographs anyway, they all think they're basically photoshopped. So one of the most historic events in the history of the world, the killing of Osama bin Laden, we never saw a photograph, in part because people no longer believe photographs. So now we have a revolution. Now something is happening where we have the opportunity to do it differently. And the inspiration for me is Cortázar. I always say, I was in Argentina last year, I say, if you want to know the future of new media, read Borges, Bioy Casares, and Cortázar, and you'll know the future of new media. Because I think they understood it. But he has a sentence at the beginning of Babas del Diablo, which I'll read in the English and you'll hear in the Spanish. It'll never be known how this has to be told, in the first person or in the second, using the third person plural, or continually inventing modes that will serve for nothing. If one might say, I will see the moon rose, or we hurt me at the back of my eyes, and especially you, the blonde woman, was the clouds the race before my, your, his, our, yours, their faces, what the hell? So we don't know how to tell the story. Do we tell it in the first person? Do we tell it in the second person and the third person? And that's exactly where we are today. Social media is about telling it in the second person, we or me. It's not about them, it's about us. So the most important image from the Iraq War, from Abu Ghraib, was not done by professionals. It's not about them, it's about us. It's our party where we torture people. It's we. What Cortázar was asking, do we tell it first person, second person, third person? Neda Sultan in Iran was done by a passerby. It's our revolution. We tell it. We tell the story. Not it's about them, it's about us. In Gaddafi, the killing of Gaddafi in Libya, it's we. We made the revolution. It's our pictures. We make the pictures for ourselves. It's us. I is telling the story. The blog, the I is telling the story. I had a student from Libya, or at New York University, and I asked her, with all the photographs, what was important to you from the Libyan Revolution, 6 months? And she said only one. It was a picture of my grandfather smiling for the first time in 40 years when he was standing next to the dead body of Gaddafi in the meat locker. She got it on the email, a cell phone photograph. That was the only image that was important to her. The photograph made about we, not about them. So this is Question Bridge, an incredible project in the United States where people went around asking black men questions to ask other black men. So they would ask other black men, and the other black men would answer, and they would ask questions of other black men. And it's an installation of 5 video screens of people asking each other questions. Do you have problems eating fried chicken in front of white people? Questions among themselves, and they would answer each other. It goes for 4 hours. So it's not about them, it's about us. It's we. This is about we. This is people who are handicapped, disabled in Geneva, Switzerland. And what they do is they photograph Geneva to show each other, this is a place, if you're in a wheelchair, do not go. You can't go up the steps. They make their own maps, their own photographs of their own city to help each other figure it out. This is one of my students, Iman, from Cairo. And the interesting thing was the outside photojournalists would show battles almost like World War II during the Arab Spring. But inside, what was happening was the people in Egypt knew some of the police were shooting in their eyes, sharpshooters, on purpose to blind them. And so one man became very famous. His first eye was shot out in February at a big demonstration. And then everybody started to wear eye patches. And they shot out his second eye in the second demonstration in October. And hundreds of people had their eyes shut out, which most people in the world don't know, but people in Egypt know. So it's about us. But the media is not globalized enough that we know about them. In Tunisia, this was the baguette man during the Arab Spring, who was very famous. He stood against the military with a baguette. But again, we didn't see the image in most of the world, but they saw it there. The photographs were we. This is Base Track, which is on display here in Montevideo now. And what they did was they used iPhones, 5 photographers, professionals, but they created a Facebook page for the families, so the families could discuss and could look at their children and their soldiers, look at their husbands, their wives who are soldiers, and create a Facebook page to discuss what was going on. So they were frustrated because the media did not publish very many pictures of the war. In all the 11 years of the war in Afghanistan, there are no iconic images. It's unlike the Vietnam War. There's no interest in the same way, so they decided to make images for each other, for the families, mostly using iPhones. We did this project on Pixel Press, working with the Daylight Foundation, where cameras were given to civilians in Iraq. The project probably cost no more than $200, and people talked after the U.S. invaded. People talked, this is the barber, this is my friend, and you begin to understand the people as people, not as people who kill each other, who explode each other. To me, this is the most important photograph from the Iraq War, because I understand that people go to the dentist. Usually in magazines, you just see the bombs. They seem crazy. They don't seem like us. They seem differently. So like Cortázar said, is how do you tell the story? Is it us? Is it them? It's I, it's we. How do you do it? And now this is one of the incredible things to me as a professional photographer was in Syria, and a rebel group, he was able to accompany them, and as he accompanied them, they gave him access to people decapitation, the head being cut off. And in one day, he photographed 4 decapitations in 4 different places, 4 men having their heads cut off by the rebel group, but they thought it was good publicity to have a professional show it to the world, so it was published around the world. So we've also reached a limit where it's possible now to photograph the most obscene, the most grotesque, the most horrible. There's also a lot of projects to make sense of what's going on. This is called Watching Syria's War, the New York Times, and they have a staff of people trying to interpret the videos made by Syrians, to interpret the photographs. Because 28 journalists were killed there last year, it's very difficult to work, so it's more and more necessary to interpret the work by people on the ground. So this is, for example, Storyful on the left. It's a new company. If I was a young person now, this is what I would do. Storyful, their job is to look through social media and authenticate and give context to all the billions of photographs, to the ones that are important. And on the right, this is something from the European Journalism Center, a verification handbook coming out in February. How do you decide if digital imagery is real or not, if it's authentic? And they tell you how to do it with sound, with video, with photography. That's coming in February. So then the revolution for me is this, in part. Jeff Wall's photograph, Dead Men Talking in Afghanistan. It's a setup photograph with actors, photographed in Canada, but it's called Dead Men in Afghanistan. It sold recently for $3.6 million. But Susan Sontag in her last book said this is the only anti-war photograph that she knows in 2003. So what interested me is if somebody asked me, could you show me a book about the photography of war? There's hundreds of books. But if somebody asked me, can you show me a book on the photography of peace? There are no books. We have no genre of the photography of peace. It doesn't exist. So to me, if there's a revolution, then we have to think in revolutionary ways. I prefer photography of peace to photography of war. I'd rather have a photography that's proactive and prevents a war rather than a photography that reacts to war and makes beautiful pictures of war. It's okay? Okay, so for example, photographers are beginning to think that by going to war and photographing the explosions, it's important, but there's other ways to do it. This was an assignment for People magazine. This is the wedding of this man. He had many, many operations. He lost his arm, his face was burned very badly. He lost part of his sight, and his girlfriend from high school waited for him to marry him from the Iraq War. And this is their wedding day. To me, it's a horrible picture, what happens to people. People magazine refused to publish the picture that they assigned, but it won a World Press Photo Award, so people came to know it. But to me, this becomes an anti-war photograph. This becomes a photograph that says, war happens to all of us, it just doesn't happen over there, and it's horrific and people have to live with it. The man in the photograph died last year. This is by Jennifer Carroty, and she works with soldiers from the Iraq and Afghanistan war, and she asks them to, and she works 1 month with each person, and she asks them to reenact the trauma from the war. So this man is now in New York, but when a garbage truck goes over a bump, it makes a certain noise, and he thinks he's again in Iraq, and the explosion is going off, and he goes to the ground. So by doing this, the different people show their families. Like this woman arrived in Iraq as a medic, and she was told immediately, I think she was 19, to save the life of a young woman. She was 19 years old. She just arrived. So she reenacts it at her home with her mother, her child, so they know what she went through in terms of trauma. So this man, when he's in the United States, but still when he drives, he sees something on the side of the road, he thinks it's going to explode, so he has to stop his car. So she works with them to restage it so their husbands, their wives, their friends understand what they're going through. In a way, these are more therapeutic. This is Riley and his story by Monica Haller. She had a friend from university, was a medic in Abu Ghraib prison. All he wanted to do was come back from the war normal, but he did not. He forgot most of what happened. So she worked with him and his photographs to make a book. And the point of making the book was to help him remember what happened because he was so traumatized he forgot half of it. And he said, pictures create a concrete reality. At least I know these things happened. They continue to serve that purpose. Like he had nightmares and dreams and horrible things, but at least the pictures told him what happened. And now, unbelievably, what she's just done is she's finishing 50 books with soldiers, with their parents, with civilians in Iraq, each one working with her to go through what happened to them in the war so that it becomes concrete and they can deal with it. To me, this is more a photography of peace. It's not glamorizing war. The New York Times has a memorial site for all the soldiers killed in Iran and Afghanistan, and every time you click on a small square, like a pixel, another face comes up. These are all people who died in the Iraq and Afghanistan war. They all died there. So it becomes a monument to them. And to me, this also serves a purpose so that the people are not forgotten who died in the wars. And I'm horrified because every time I click, there's another person. And you could also put in a place like Brooklyn, New York, and find all the people who died from Brooklyn. I put in the name Rodriguez, and there was like a dozen people named Rodriguez who died in Iraq and Afghanistan. It has search mechanism. And this you may know from Argentina, Gustavo Hermano's work, which I find very, very important about the disappeared. And what he does is he several decades later, he goes to the family photograph and restages it, but there's one person missing who has disappeared by the government. And to me, what's incredible about these images is the idea that the other person has to grow old without the person who's been disappeared. It's both about the loss, but it's also about living with the loss as the absence. You know, you can be two brothers, and one time you run down the hill and you're happy, and the next time you have a pot belly and the other brother is no longer with you. Or one time you're a baby and the next time you have no parents. So I think that this work is very, very powerful in the idea that people, in memory, that people are not forgotten, that people are present with us. Some people are working forensic photography, Gil Perez, a number of people from Argentina and so on, and they're just photographing the mass graves so the scientists could identify what's left so that people can grieve. To me, this is part of healing and more peace photography. Susan Meiselas in Nicaragua during the Sandinista Revolution, and she goes back with the photographs she made 30 years ago, and she puts them in the places where she photographed them so the young people would know their own history. You know, when they walk by, they'd be able to see what happened in the same street where they lived. They may not know what happened 30 years ago. This is a project I did with Gil Perez on Bosnia. When the web began, I went to the New York Times. I said, the web is new. Why don't we do something about peace, not about war? And they had just signed the Dayton Peace Accords. And so we did a major project online about a country, a people trying to make peace after 4 years of war, what it's like to arrive. And we made it interactive and nonlinear. This is the library they burned, so there would be no history of their own people because during the war. And you could click and go to any screen you want to. It's nonlinear in that sense. And it took about 4 hours to go through. And then I had other ideas for the digital. For example, this is a very famous photograph. But since it's online in a digital form, we could contextualize it now. So I had this four corners idea, which I've said in many, many speeches at the World Press, elsewhere, and nobody wants to do it. But the idea was the bottom right, you could click, and you get the caption and the credit, and if it's manipulated. The bottom left, you could click, and then you get the photographer giving context. Eddie Adams hated this photograph. It won the Pulitzer Prize. It won the World Press photo. It was a big anti-war photo. But he thought that he ruined the life of the general with this photograph. He thought the general was justified in executing the man in the street. You could also see the photograph before and the photograph after. You'd click on the upper left corner. On the upper right, you'd have other websites. But that means that any photographer could contextualize the imagery, and if another publication shows it, you still have the four corners telling what happened. You may know this, El libro que no puede esperar from Argentina I found. This is a fantastic book. In Buenos Aires, I bought last year. It comes in plastic, and once you open the plastic, the book begins to disappear. All the writing disappears. And in 3 or 4 months, there's no more writing. The page is blank. And the idea is these are young Argentinian writers, Latin American writers, fiction writers, and the bookstore doesn't want you to wait for their old and famous. They want you to read it right away, so they make the book disappear. So we often ask the question, you know, with the internet, with all that there's nothing sacred anymore about all these images. So why not make disappearing books? You have to read it in 6 months. You have to look at the images. The war is going on now. You have to see it before the book disappears. Why not? So this is after several months. I have a copy. It's after 6 months. I still have some words left. So that's the book. So in Pixel Press online, we did things like when the United States was attacked on September 11th, we showed that in Afghanistan, Kabul, a picture by Salgado on the right, was also attacked. So why do we want to bomb them? We did that before we bombed Afghanistan, because that's not where the people who attacked New York came from. That's not where they were. But we bombed them. Why? They were already bombed. They looked just like us. 1 year later, it was September 11th in Chile. You know, as Allende, we all know, was deposed. So we said the Pentagon was attacked on September 11th in the US, and Chile was attacked on September 11th. So we're not alone in the world. Other people were attacked. Chile was attacked. We were attacked. We have something in common. People do not use photographs politically. They do not use photographs as resistance. But people tend to just show what is, but without trying to think what should be. So this is from Colombia, semana.com. And I think it's just a very interesting interactive use. This is the Minister of Agriculture. Nobody usually cares very much about the Minister of Agriculture. But if you click on different parts of his body, the redes sociales, he'll tell you about his different opinions. So by clicking on the different parts of the body, he tells you about his style. If you click on his wallet, on his purse, he tells you about his money ideas. If you click on his heel, he tells you his Achilles, his weakness. So this idea of the interactive portrait, so you could click on many, many places. It's not boring that way, it's exciting. But for the most part, we don't want to be exciting. But we're in a revolution, we should be exciting. We should do something that's different all the time, every day. This is my idea for postcards from the future. So with climate change, I wanted to photograph, according to scientists, places around the world, what they'll look like in 40 years, 50 years with climate change if we don't do anything. So my idea was to photograph the future so it does not happen, to photograph the bad things, the droughts, the problems, so we can see, you know, what would Montevideo look like in 50 years, so we do something against it. So we photograph the future so the bad future does not happen. Understand? Yeah? Okay, so this is a few more projects. Jim Balog is an environmentalist, a mountain climber, and what he decided was to do was to put cameras to automatically photograph in glaciers around the world, like once an hour, once a half hour, so scientists could see over time the changes. So in these very, very cold places, he put cameras, he also made pictures, but he's not just a photographer, he wanted to help. He has 2 daughters. He wanted the world to be a better place. So he thought by putting cameras, the scientists and we also can see what's happening in the world, so we can do something about it. I hate photography that waits for the disaster to make strong pictures. I love photography that sees a disaster could come and tries to make images so there is no disaster. So this is Chris Jordan, and he goes in Midway Island in the Pacific, and these are birds that died. He's an artist, but even as an artist, he's working also about the world. I don't want to divide documentary and art. I think they overlap tremendously, but you can see how the birds died, what they ate, the plastic in the ocean. And to me, if this is not an early warning sign of what we should be doing, I don't know what it is. So you can buy these in an art gallery, but they also tell us something about the world. So artists are contributing. This is Gideon Mendel's work that's here in Montevideo, The Drowning World. So he's trying to show us with climate change, with flooding, what's happening in many, many countries. And this is JR, the French photographer, who you probably know. So he has this idea that women are heroes. So he goes to places like in Kenya, in Africa, and he makes fantastic big photographs of very poor women because he thinks they do much of the work or most of the work, and they don't have respect. But not only that, he makes them out of water-resistant material so they could put it on the roofs of their houses so in the rainy season they do not get wet. So it's not just that he celebrates them in photographs, he gives them a new roof. So he's practical as well. So when the train goes by, he makes it so the eyes of the women come, so they have eyes when the train comes by. Yeah? So this is on the death row in the United States. We still execute people. So a number of artists have done The Last Meal in the United States, you can order your last meal before they kill you in the prison. And of course, because sometimes you have a budget of $20, $30, you could buy. But it always amazes to me what prisoners get at their last meal before they die. And to me, this is more effective than showing the person, because you understand how pathetic and how sad the life is. Would I want to drink 4 2-liter bottles of soda before I die? It's certainly a class difference. You don't see too many millionaires getting executed. This is another project in a prison system in solitary confinement. There are prisoners who never see the outside. So there's volunteers around the world, and they ask for, I want to see the street where my aunt lives. And they go and they photograph the street where the aunt lives. I want to see a mosque in Saudi Arabia. I want to see a new car. I want to see the front of the prison. And the volunteers go and photograph it for them. And their protest and making these pictures, they were able recently to close down a maximum security prison. So they stopped the prison. But to me, there's a sadness that you never see the outside. And you have to ask volunteers around the world to make photographs for you of what's out there, because you could be years without seeing it. So the questions become to me, what do we do without a front page in the newspaper? As more and more newspapers go out of business, Newsweek magazine in the US just went out of business. New York magazine announced yesterday that they're only going to publish every 2 weeks instead of every week. The UN is expecting in the next 10 or 15 years, there'll be almost no print newspapers in the world. So how do we communicate about what's going on in the world? How do we focus? And how do we respond as society? So I did, for example, a project 2 years ago where everybody comes up, what should be on the front page? I had the idea that if each of us paid, I'm heartbroken. If everybody contributed, the equivalent of $3, $5, and we asked smart people or a 15-year-old in Syria, what should be on the front page? We have to develop new forms of the front page. Google Glass is coming. So what are we going to do with all this new technology? How do we make our lives better with it? When Robert Capa was photographing in the 1930s, he had new technology, new cameras, new films, and they were able to photograph battle for the first time while it was happening. So photography in the 1930s had to use new technology, and they came up with some amazing stuff. What are we going to do with all this stuff? So Witness.org and the Guardian Project came up with the Obscura Cam. In many demonstrations, for example in Iran, when you photograph an anti-government demonstration, they then crowdsource the image and arrest everybody in the photograph. So the Obscura Cam is an algorithm, so you cannot see anybody's face in a political demonstration. You can download it online. It's for Android cell phones. This is a narrative which is coming out now from Sweden. It's called life logging. It's a button you put on your jacket. It makes a photograph automatically every 30 seconds, all day for the rest of your life if you want, so people can see what you're doing. It goes right online, and it also somehow edits it for you. This is Michael Wolf, which is on display in Montevideo, Google Street Views, where there's surveillance issues, enormous surveillance issues. But I'm going to end, because I have 3 minutes left, and speak about this. There's 2 or 3 just things I want to say, which is in the After Photography book. It's not an accident that we developed digital media, which is code-based, at the same time we began to think of ourselves as code-based, as made of DNA. It's not an accident. We did that on purpose, unconsciously. But once imagery is in code, if you photograph, you can make music with it. You could output it as anything you want. So this is David Rokeby in Canada. For 20 years, he's been using cameras. It's called the very nervous system. And when he moves, it photographs him, but then it comes out as music. So my sense is that in the next few years, somebody carrying a camera may be a musician. Anything in code, a photograph, for example, this is a photograph, a Japanese artist. Every day he turned the day's news photograph into music. He wrote a program, so every day's news photograph became music. Why not? So a painting becomes music. I had a student who interpreted de Kooning photographs, de Kooning paintings, turned it into music. So Pedro Mayer's family album. This is Pedro Mayer, the Mexican photographer, on the left as the father. This is Pedro Mayer, the Mexican photographer, on the right as the son. So Pedro Mayer is in the image twice, with his own son and in his own father. The family album of the future will play with time. If you're divorced, get rid of your husband. If you don't need them anymore in the family album. You can do all kinds of things now with the family album. But I end with just two ideas, just to reassure Veronica. One is this. This is Gideon Mendel, who I showed the global warming in Montevideo at the park, the Rodo. So the idea was that nobody wanted to pay for medicines for people in Africa who are HIV positive, the governments, the NGOs, because they thought they were not disciplined enough to take the medicine, which was racist. So Gideon, who's from South Africa, went back to South Africa and photographed a pilot project. This woman, her T-cell count was almost 0. And then he came back and photographed her after a while with the medicine. And then he photographed her again with the medicine. She took the medicine. The project worked. And the UN AIDS sent me an email saying that because of this one photographer, there are probably 8 million people in Africa alive today because he made these pictures to convince the world to give the medicines. I think it's incredible for one photographer to help 8 million people. Magnum Photographers, the Access to Life, was also on HIV and medicines. They worked with the Global Fund. And the Global Fund sent an email to Magnum Photos saying, because of your 8 photographers, we received $1 billion to give medicines for people who are HIV positive. $1 billion. One of the government officials in Japan gave a speech at the UN. He went to the show. They were going to give $200 million to help HIV, people who are HIV positive. But in 45 minutes of looking at photographs, they doubled the contribution to $400 million. So 45 minutes of looking at photographs was worth $200 more million. So there's enormous things that can be done with photographs in the world right now. And this is my last image. In 1968, we photographed the Earth from outer space. The astronauts photographed it. And 16 months later, we had Earth Day, which we still have. We had the Save the Earth movement. It was possible in 1968 to make photographs that affected people around the world. It's very difficult to do that right now because people resist photographs. I think they're manipulated. They see too many of them. There are too many billions of them. We don't contextualize them. There's just so many. But there's nothing important anymore. So I think one of the extraordinary challenges for us right now, whether you're 15 years old or 50 years old, is to figure out ways that imagery can be used in the world to be helpful. Not just make more imagery, but make effective imagery. Make useful imagery so that the point of it is we move forward. And finally, the point is that when we say the word photography now, it means so many more things than it used to be. It's both dying and it's both being reborn. And the revolution really is ours. We just have to figure out what to do with it. So thank you very much.